So unit number 9, contract management. So in this unit, we're going to be talking about how companies have to deal with already signing the contract, filling the contract, and what it should be written overall throughout all the contract. In the previous unit, we talked about the negotiation part, right? On what you want, what I want, where do we reach a middle part or middle ground, but all of that has to get down in paper, and this is precisely the unit that talks about that. So let's go to some of the basics in here. So first of all, we have to understand that contract management is an activity that not precisely is mandatory, but is very critical. Why? Because we have two options. We have the option of doing it in-house using our own people, our own specialists. If that's a large company, that works very well. Or we have smaller companies where may engage with third parties on consulting companies that perhaps will be the middleman. So when we have the resources, contract management, if we have the experts, we have the resources, is an easy thing because we already have a legal department that already specializes and knows perfectly the company from A to Z. But when we have to engage a third party, companies think, should we really engage into someone, or we do it by ourselves, and we save some money? And that becomes a dichotomy that is very, very complex, because in the end, we say we spend more money, but we make sure that nothing is wrong, nothing fails. But we can save money, and let's see how. So again, this is very complex decision, but in general, it pays off. I can say in general, it pays off to have an expert to really go through your contract. And then, of course, we have this one. So when we look at the first one, the lack of investment in contract management. So the same thing, companies are always reluctant to do that investment because it's very expensive. The legal fees that we need to incur with, and the specialists, sometimes, like I said, it involves a lawyer plus a specialist, because specialists also need to know about the industry. So sometimes these companies offer both, and that gets complex. So it's an adequate activity because sometimes there's inadequate contract reviews, sometimes internally we do not very well, or sometimes if the contract management, if there's no formal process to it, the reviews are not accurate. So we have to do that. When we carry out this activity or this process in a very specialized way, we can manage changes quickly and adequately. But when we don't do it, when we don't have a formalized and standardized process for signing contracts, we don't know. Whenever there's changes, we don't react well. Then when we don't have this activity, when we don't have the contract management, we have the lack of attention to risk management. So risk management is not really well considered. So that's why it's necessary to have a very structured process of contract signing, because we need to consider also the risk. When we don't have this, we have a lack of engagement with stakeholders. The parties are not well connected. Really, they don't speak to each other, and this contract signing doesn't go very well. Then we have the lack of detailed knowledge of the contract. The same thing, when we don't have the contract management as a standardized process, parties usually don't know very well what is in the contract and what's missing. And then, of course, when we don't have the standardized process, we have the failure to take decisive action when there's an issue. Whenever there are problems, we didn't state them in the contract because we didn't have standardized process to draft that contract, to write that contract. Then, of course, we will not be able to take good actions, right? So this is what happens when we don't have standardized process to draft the contract, to review it, to sign it, and make sure that follows every step as we stipulated it. Okay, so when we're gonna have this contract management process, before we start the whole process, we have to understand a couple of things, which are, we need to understand how complex is the contract in terms of the parties involved, the supplies that we're gonna be doing, the people involved, the resources, human and financial. And the same thing whether the contractual obligations for how long they will be. So we have to understand the complexity of that. We need to understand the contract performance regime, so it means how is it going to be measured, each part of the process, the resources and cost of the contract of resource and cost of contract management. So in this case, like I mentioned before, the resources that we have also go into the complexity of it. Provision of contract change, which is if something changes, do we already stipulated what actions we're going to do in the contract already, or we're going to do let's see how a laissez-faire. There's an issue and we'll think about it. Even if it's in that way, it's good to state it in the contract. So we need to consider that in advance. Do we also have the ability of contract management skills and knowledge before engaging into the contract? We may not be experts on signing contracts, so we have to consider whether we need an external party or internal party. So we need to consider that. We also have to manage future contract risks. Before even thinking of signing a contract, we must already do a calculation, a risk management assessment. What are the possible implications, possible problems, possible likelihood of it? And then if we think that we already know the risks of it, then we go ahead and start to draft the contract. And then we have the final step, which is handover from procurement to contract management. So in this case, in the pre-award of the contract, procurement has a lot of involvement, but the final decision and the final signature and the final negotiation of it comes to top management, whether it's well, in this case it could be finance, or it could be CEO, or it could be together. So we have to think of let's say 80% or so goes from the procurement department, production, and then goes to the top management and how that's going to be handled. Okay, very good. Now we have the roles of the contract manager. So whenever we have standardized process, we will appoint a person that will be in charge of doing a couple things. So in this case, we give them the power to take decisions. Means now that you're in control of this contract, you have the decision to change things or amend things as necessary if the supplier or the buyer asks you to change it. Of course, on their certain parameters, we cannot say just do whatever you want. No, of course, I mean within this price, you can negotiate that price. Within these production levels, you can negotiate that. So we have to think of that. Then they have the role of communicating to stakeholders, both parties, always, all the time. There's these changes, there's this testing, there is this clause, so they have to make sure that the communication is crystal clear. Regularly review the risk register. If, like I said, we have done previously a risk assessment, so they have to review it constantly and check whether it's good or not, whether there's any additional risks that have arisen that previously we are not aware of. They have to deal with contract change in case there's any changes. They have to deal with the stakeholders and say, okay, there was a change in the conditions because the supply changed or whether the production changed. So we have to deal with those changes. So they have that ability to do that. Then we have conduct contract review meetings. The same thing. If there's any changes, they have the ability to say, okay, parties, let's meet, let's talk about it, and let's see how the environment has changed and what we can do in this contract and this supply chain relationship to make sure that continues to work. And then we have the application of seniority to influence supplier behavior. So in this case also we have different types of suppliers. We have older suppliers, more senior suppliers. Also we have younger suppliers. So we have to influence them to say, okay, if we have already suppliers that have been long-term relationship with us, how we continue to have that relationship. At the same time, when we have newer suppliers, how can we also foster that relationship? So we have skills and knowledge. As I told you, depending on the industry, there's people that are very well seasoned or that they have those abilities already in them. So there's things that are skills, which is more related to individuals, and then the knowledge, which is more of those individuals working extra in order to know the industry much better. So in this case, we have skills like leadership, negotiation, communication, decision making, teamwork, and relationship management are more things that perhaps they will develop over time, over with experience, and the knowledge which is more on understanding the industry from A to Z, understanding of what happens legally if there's an issue, whether we can sue or whether we cannot sue, but we can take some sort of industrial actions. The same thing, they understand the clauses of the contracts very well. So this knowledge goes more into individuals really getting to know the regulations and the industry. If they know the regulations and the industry, they're gonna be good contract managers. We have here some examples, some technical ones and some interpersonal ones. So in this case, that talks about that very well. Now we have essential considerations. So in this case, we have things to consider when we're doing this contract management process, which is understanding the precise wording. Here lawyers always are, they love to use ambiguous words, so we have to make sure that there's no ambiguous words throughout the contract, because otherwise that can lead to gray areas, and those gray areas in the future represent some problems to us. The same thing, we need to consider how will the performance will be measured. Are we gonna have by monthly reviews? That's in terms of time, in terms of performance, whether you're supplying at the right times with the right quality, and whether we have a testing for that. Also, we test the quality constantly against our measurements or against your measurements, or is there any government body or any independent body that can do that testing for us, right? And then what happens when service product fails acceptance testing? If this testing is failed because the external party or the person assessing that testing says, okay, you provided this material with deficient quality because in the end it broke or keeps on breaking with the consumer, so we have to do the review of the contract. So who pays what? You pay me for the damages, I pay for the damages, or how is that? And the same thing for certification. In this case also we have to consider that sometimes in some industry certification is required, like for example in the pharmaceutical industry, it has to be done, and sometimes these quality tests are also carried out by certain associations, some government associations. Some of them are directly related to the government. Sometimes they are just certified by the government, but they work as external bodies. They have no funding. They have the funding from the government, but they don't have jurisdiction over them. And then we have contract clauses. There's many things that we need to consider, that we need to put in the contract, because if these are not put into the contract, that's subject to gray areas in the contract, and gray areas always lead to some kind of conflict. So we had to think of audit rights, whether we have the right to go and check what our supplier is doing or the manufacturer is doing. If something's not working, says, do I have the right to go and check your facilities? The same assignment of certain duties, roles, positions, any kind of assignment of a certain thing. Also, I can assign a person to be in your company and check this, so that goes into the contract. Like I said, assignments is very general. We have clauses of contract change. If there's any change, do we need to renegotiate or not, or we'll just continue as initially we agree? We have contract variations, and that is very similar to contract change. Also the same, there's some small things that change, so how are we going to deal with that? We have to stipulate it before we sign the contract. Key people that is appointed, and even if that person resigns, who's going to take over that? Most of the time goes in terms of position, not in name. When we're doing these contractual negotiations, we put usually I don't know how to say, for example, the person responsible for this is a director of procurement. We don't put the name because in the end that may change, and that represents a problem because we have to re-sign the contract every time that the person resigns or changes. Milestone, as in what have we achieved, when we achieved it, right? So we have to put that also in terms of performance for the contract. We have the force majeure. If there's something that is external to us, there were some external conditions, environmental conditions that happen. We have the liability clauses, which is who is liable, you, me, or no one. Usually force majeure, nobody is liable, but in some industries may happen. Then we have indexation of price. Also, the price changes, fluctuations. We have to make it sure we stipulate not the price, but if there's fluctuations, under what conditions is acceptable, under what conditions is not. Then we have the insurance of the goods. This happens a lot, that there's a lot of miscarriages, there's problems, there's damaged merchandise. So we always have to engage an insurance company. And if there's not an insurance company involved, why we decided not to do it. Then we have also rejection of any sort of kind. If there's a clause and you reject it, or if there's a certain proposal or offer and it's rejected, how we have to deal with that. If maybe their supplier, well, we have a certain agreement, let's say in personnel, and they reject it, then what are we going to do with that? How are we going to deal with that? Do we have to meet? Do we have to discuss? So that goes in there. And that goes also together with the step in, right? So which is, in this case, who has to step in case there's a certain problem or issue. And finally, and one of the most important ones, is the termination clause. Especially when we're talking about long-term relationships, terminations are not easy. Yeah, when you have a girlfriend that you spend a relationship just 1 week with her, it's not a big issue. But when you were married for 20 years, who belongs to who, that is a very big issue. And that is the same thing with companies. They share information, they share rights, they have a lot of intertwined things. So they have to make a clear cut of what belongs to who, even before starting the agreement. Okay? Because in the end, when things get ugly, everybody wants everything. Simple as that. And then well, that's it for this lecture. Then there's a very interesting case of the contract life cycle example. This one, they show how everything happens. I think it's a very good video to watch. Probably only those of you who are really interested into the supply chain will watch it, but I mean, I really recommend it to you. The same thing is that there was another video. This video is also very good because they explain what are all the implications of the contract management. This is, for example, from a company that is an external company, and what do they do for their clients. So make sure you watch it. I think this one is a must. The other one is more I give you the benefit of not watching it, but this one, at least, you must watch it. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.